Hello, welcome to this lecture on network data and network types. Just sort of an introduction to what are networks, how do we store them, how do we look at them and represent them. So let me turn on my slides. So what is a social network? You should have a basic understanding of this by now. But it's composed, typically we think of it as nodes, or sometimes these are called vertices. We'll refer to them as nodes in this class, which are usually in a social network people. A network, like the idea of network science is a little broader than this. And so a node could represent, for example, a power plant or an animal or a plant. Or really almost anything that can be connected in some way to other things. And that brings us to the next concept, which is an edge or a tie. And those terms I find myself using fairly interchangeably. They both kind of mean the same thing, and that's a relationship between nodes. So for people, this usually is something like friendship. So an edge or a link between two people, they're linked if they are friends with each other. But it doesn't have to be something positive like friendship. It can be hatred. People can be linked if they hate each other. Or we can have, we'll talk about later, as multiplex ties, where the same network includes both information about friendship and hatred, if we consider those kind of, two distinct types. We can have advice networks. Who do you go to for advice? And time spent together. As, again, another type of network. We'll talk about how these are represented. We're going to talk for a second about two different ideas that we may notice when looking at these types of relationships. One is that networks can be signed, we call it. So this can be that it's positive or negative, or that it can have strength. That you may have like different levels of friendship, that you're a stronger or weaker friend. We might represent that with like a bigger number for a better relationship, or you might represent friendship and hatred along the same scale, that some amount of liking, and it goes from sort of negative to positive. The other idea is of direction, that a network can be directed or undirected. So when we think about time spent together, that will be an undirected network, because I can't spend time with you without you spending time with me. It's impossible that's something that happens at the same time. Sometimes this is, if we think about like social networks, this is encapsulated in code. So for example, on Facebook, you can only be friends with someone who is also friends with you. That's an undirected network. On Twitter, on the other hand, you can follow someone who does not follow you. In other words, it's undirected. You can go to someone for advice who does not come to you for advice. So that can be represented directed. And we'll talk a little bit about how that looks, throughout the class, but a little bit today. Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot I had one more example. Diseases transmitted. So if we think about, like, for example, COVID transmission, this is often opaque. This may not be something we actually know, but theoretically there exists a network that is who you got, COVID or the flu or a cold from, and who they got it from, etc. So this would be, again, like a directed graph. Okay, so how is this network stored? There are three main ways that we represent network data. The first is a matrix. So this stuff at the top here is R code. You will understand it before too long in this course, but basically, for now, it's fine if it totally looks weird and incomprehensible. Basically, this creates a network, a Watts-Strogatz network, which we'll talk a little bit about, and then this converts that internal network representation into a matrix, and then this shows what that matrix is. So a matrix is a kind of almost like a spreadsheet. It has rows and columns, and for a network matrix, typically the node or the columns and rows both represent nodes. So this column represents node 1, and this is the label. So 1, 2, 3, 4, we have 16 nodes here. And then the column, they are unlabeled, but this represents node 1 as well. This represents node 2, etc. And so the way that R represents it, these dots mean that there is no relationship, and the 1 means that there is a relationship of weight 1. And so node 1 is connected to node 2 with weight 1. And conversely, node 2 is connected to node 1 with weight 1. So this row lists all of the other nodes that node 1 is connected to. So it's 2, 4, 5, and then don't want to embarrass myself by trying to count, but 3, 6, 7, 8, etc. And I think this is an undirected network, because you'll notice if we look in the column, we'll see, oh yeah, there we go, 2, 4, 5, 8, and 13 are the nodes that node 1 is connected to. So this is also 2, 4, 5, etc. So it is, yeah, so that's what a matrix is. That's one way of representing a network. It's one that's really useful for a lot of the math that goes on behind the scenes, which we'll talk about, kind of making measures of sort of what's going on in a network. But for people, it's really not that useful. It's difficult to see what's going on. I mean, we can get maybe a general sense that there are like not that many connections or a lot of connections in a network, but that's sort of all that we can kind of get, depending, maybe if you like ordered it in a certain way, you might learn things, etc. But in general, it's much easier for a computer to understand these than it is for a person. And that also goes for edge lists. So this is the second main way of representing network data. This is the one that's easier if you're, for example, creating a network. Excuse me. So this takes that same network, which we call the SW, and shows the edge list for it. An edge list is just, like it sounds, a list of all the edges or ties between nodes. So this says there's a tie between node 1 and node 2. There's a tie between node 1 and node 5, between node 3 and node 6, etc. And so this only lists the edges. And so, for example, even if you had a network of 1,000 nodes, it would be very big to represent that in a matrix. Let's say there's only 6 connections between them. That'd be really short as an edge list. So there we go. So it's kind of a more compact way. Again, even more than matrices, really, really basically impossible for people to sort of figure out what's going on with this. It's not, you might be able to look at it and say like, okay, it looks like I see, I don't even know, like node 13 a lot or something like that. So maybe that, but even then, it's really hard. Like I honestly couldn't tell you. It looks like 1 actually does show up quite a few times. It's really hard to tell, to get basically any information from this edge list as a person. Again, really made for computers. And so what do we need as people? Let me see if I can get can't quite see the bottom of that. That's all right though. We need a visual representation. And so one way of doing that is with figures. So graphs, plots, sociograms, these are all basically the same terms for the same thing. So this is that same graph. Again, don't worry that you don't understand this, but it's plotted. And so if we look at, let's see if we can find node 1. There's node 1, who's connected again to where's node 2? Node 2, so we draw a line to represent an edge. Connected to node 2, and 4, and 5, and 8, and 13. And so here we can start with, there's some cool algorithms. This one uses, I think it's called a spring embedded algorithm, that sort of tries to keep nodes together that are all connected to each other and move apart ones that are only connected, that are not connected to that group. And so we can sort of see it helps us to see there's sort of a group of nodes up here, a group here, and then sort of these ones that are on the periphery. And so we can really start to get some information that we couldn't get as people just looking at the other representations. And there's lots more that we can do and that we'll learn how to do in this course to kind of get insight from these representations, as well as from sort of the metrics and measurements we might make. So where does social network data come from? If this is how we represent it, how do we get it in the first place? And there are a few answers. The most common one is from surveys. So, maybe you would ask everyone at your organization, who do you go to for advice? Who are you friends with, etc. And then represent it that way. Observation. So you might, set up a video camera looking at a shop floor and look at who talks to who and kind of make measurements that way. Or, a researcher might enter a classroom and look at which kids talk to each other. And finally, my research typically uses digital trace data. So I've done work on wikis, for example, on Wikipedia. When you make an edit to a wiki, it records who made that edit. And so we might make a network of people who edit the same pages, something like that. And so we store or can grab traces of what people have done and use that to infer things about their relationships. So there are a few different kind of types of networks. One, or ways of thinking about how the getting this network translates into the representation. So one is an ego network. This is where an individual called the ego, it represents them, their connections, so their friends, for example, and then connections between their connections. So this might represent friends. Sorry, the bottom one's cut off there. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's node 4 that you can't see. So node 1 is friends with nodes 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then, oh no, this is from that same graph. So it was 8, if I remember right. Friends with 2, 3, 5, 6, and 8. And 6 and 8 are friends with each other, but none of the others. 3 is not friends with 5, 5 is not friends with 2, etc. So this is kind of zooming in. In that case, we had the full network data, but we're zooming in on just one node and sort of the connections around that node. The other, typically it won't work that way. When we think of ego networks, usually the reason we have them is we get them from, for example, a survey. We surveyed node 1 and ask, who are your friends and which of them are friends with each other? And so this, while it seems very limited in scope, it can actually tell us a lot of information. We can learn things if we have, for example, different ego graphs for different people. We can do things like compare how many friends they have, how connected they are to each other. Is this someone who's embedded in a tight network, or do their friends kind of not know each other? And a lot of times this can be used to learn or to predict things about that person. Will they have the social support that they need? Will they be able to find a job, et cetera? And we'll talk about how this connects to those later in the class. Oh, sorry, yeah. So the other idea is an extended ego network. So this is sort of the next version of this. And so in this case, again, we had the complete network. So this starts with number 1, looks at all of their friends, and then looks at all the friends of their friends. So this goes out 2 degrees, but you can sort of imagine this could go further and further to look sort of centered on one individual. What is the larger context in which that person exists? And this, again, can be gathered through surveys. And so what we would do is, or interviews, etc. We'd survey node 1, ask them who their friends are, and then go to their friends. This is called snowball sampling, and survey them and ask about who their friends are and which of them are friends with each other, etc. So this can give us even a little bit more context, right? We can start to see that maybe node 1 is part of 2 different groups, like this group where lots of people know each other and this group where lots of people know each other. And maybe understanding that can be helpful or useful. Another kind of strange kind of network type is a bipartite network. So in this, I'm going to show you in just a second. I took 20 random Redditors, users on Reddit, chose them randomly and found the communities that they're connected to, the subreddits that they've participated in. So on the top, this is all the subreddits that they've participated in. On the bottom, this is our 20 random Redditors. And an edge between them means that they've commented. So this user has commented in this group of subreddits, etc. So we can do things with this. So this is what the actual data looks like. It's the name of the user and the subreddit they participated in and how many times they posted in that subreddit. So that's what the data comes from. There's some kind of measures that we can use. There are different ways of representing bipartite networks. The kind of key idea is that, and at least in the original version of it, it's two different types of nodes, right? That one type is never connected to itself. A user is not connected to a user in this graph because there's no way for them to be connected. You can't comment on a user, right? You can only comment in a subreddit, and a subreddit can't comment in another subreddit. And so we often project them, it's called. And so that's looking. So for example, this is the people, excuse me, who post in the same communities. So this, user 1 here and 2 here, and if they've posted in the same community, then there's an edge between them, right? So this is a user-to-user graph of who's connected to who. And we can see that there's some structure here. That people, unsurprisingly, people who are similar to each other post in the same communities. We can also project it the other direction. So this is communities that have the same users. And so again, we can see, big clusters. There's one kind of big giant component, we call it, here, and then some other clusters where people who participate in this community comment in the same communities or participate in that cluster. So this can be really useful. This sorts of projection can be a useful way of understanding and learning structure about kind of both sides, either type of node. The other idea that I want to talk about really quickly is this idea that nodes and edges can have attributes. This can be represented, we'll talk about this more, but that we can think of nodes and edges as sort of spreadsheets. That's a nice way of representing them. That's that a node can have things about it, right? These are usually people for us, and so there can be, we might have things like age or gender or location, year in school, etc. And we might want to visualize that, to think about how that influences or relates to network properties. And so when we're visualizing these, often we will use different colors for different attributes. We might use different sizes. We'll talk about different approaches that you can take. And same thing for edges. We might have different types of edges. The most common version for an edge is weight, right? So that different, this one is drawn a little bit thicker because these two nodes, are better friends or communicate more, etc. But we might represent, for example, different types. We might represent friendship and advice in the same network, and so maybe we'd have them be a different color. So this is sort of like a really quick overview of what networks are, how we can visualize them, or how we represent them. So what can we learn? Why would we do all of this? I think some is we can learn metrics about the network. We'll talk a lot about this, but things like density, how many people are connected to each other, clustering, how likely is it that people are connected to their friends' friends, and we'll talk about sort of the meanings of those throughout the class. Also things about the nodes, who has power or influence or popularity, and again, this is this is without knowing anything or taking into account the things about the person, right? Their gender or age or things like that. We can also look at how things change over time and gain insight into what's going on in a network. So I think that's it. So hopefully that helps you to gain a basic understanding of sort of what networks are, how we represent them, and what we can learn from them.